Where the Road Leads. Chapter 6. Accounts. After a warm meal and a hot bath, Wei Ying felt human again. The dust of travel had been washed away. His stomach was pleasantly full. The bed looked inviting enough to immediately fall asleep on. Yet instead of resting, he sat down at the small table by the window. There was something he needed to do first. From his Qinquan pouch, he retrieved a small blank notebook. One of many Qing Yuan had given him. This one had no title yet. Wei Ying carefully prepared the inkstone, ground the ink, set out his brush, then opened to the first page. After a moment's thought, he wrote a single word at the top. Finance. He nodded to himself. A very important subject. Especially now. Unlike disciples of great sects, nobody would be providing food, lodging, or cultivation resources for him anymore. From this day onward, everything depended on him, which meant he needed to know exactly how much he possessed. No guessing. No assumptions. Facts. Only facts. He first took out the pouch Jiang Fengyan had given him, the larger of the two. When he emptied it onto the table, copper coins scattered everywhere. Several silver taels rolled across the wooden surface. Wei Ying immediately began sorting them. Copper coins into neat stacks, silver taels into separate piles. Then he counted. Twice. Just to be certain. Only after confirming the amount did he carefully record it in the notebook. Next came Qing Yuan's pouch. This one was considerably simpler. Almost entirely silver taels. The sight still made him pause. A month's allowance. Perhaps more. The old healer had handed it over as though it were nothing. Wei Ying counted every tael carefully, then recorded the total beneath the first entry. Once both pouches were accounted for, he sat back and reviewed the page. His current reserves. Everything he owned. Everything standing between him and starvation. It wasn't an insignificant amount, especially for a 10-year-old. Still, he knew better than to become complacent. Money disappeared surprisingly quickly. Turning to the next page, he drew several straight lines, dividing the paper into columns. After a moment's consideration, he labeled them. Date, income, expenditure. Simple, practical, easy to maintain. Under today's date, he carefully listed his expenses. Boat fare, in-room, bath service, food. Each amount was written down neatly. When he finished, he reviewed the figures, then nodded in satisfaction. This would work. Wei Ying dipped his brush into fresh ink. The numbers on the page drew his attention. His reserves looked substantial now. But that could change. Quickly, very quickly. He understood something many children did not. Money was not endless. And unlike most cultivators, he had no sect supporting him. As a rogue cultivator, work would be inconsistent. Some days there would be opportunities. Other days there would be nothing. If he waited until his savings ran low before seeking employment, he would already be in trouble. No, he needed to begin earning immediately. Not because he was desperate, because it was sensible. A lesson both his lives had taught him. Prepare before you need something, not after. His thoughts drifted briefly toward food. A growing child required regular meals. A cultivator required even more. Good food. Nutritious food. His body was his greatest asset. The thing he valued most in either life. The thing he refused to neglect. No matter how careful he became with money, he would never compromise on maintaining his health. Not after everything. Never again. Outside, the sounds of the city drifted through the open window. Voices. Laughter. Merchants advertising their wares. The morning market appeared especially lively. Wei Ying rose from his chair and walked over. Looking down onto the street below, the city was awake, bustling, alive. People moved in every direction, carrying goods, selling food, doing business, living. A smile appeared on his face. Somewhere out there was his first opportunity. Perhaps a job, perhaps information, perhaps an adventure, perhaps nothing at all. But he intended to find out. Returning to the table, he carefully gathered the coins. Everything went back into their respective pouches. The notebook followed. Then the Qinquan pouch swallowed it all. Safe, organized, secure. His sword was placed inside as well. Not because he feared carrying it. Because a wandering child openly carrying a spiritual sword attracted attention. And attention was the last thing he wanted. At least for now. With everything prepared, Wei Ying adjusted his robes and headed downstairs. The innkeeper offered him a friendly nod. Wei Ying returned it, then stepped out into the streets of Ezhou. Warm sunlight greeted him immediately. The scent of food drifted from nearby stalls. Merchants called to passing customers. Children ran through the streets laughing. The city stretched before him, filled with possibilities. Wei Ying took a deep breath, then started walking. Today, he would find work. And if he couldn't find work, then he would learn, observe, explore. Because every city had something to teach, and he intended to learn as much as possible. By midday, Wei Ying had already learned something important. His greatest strength wasn't cultivation. It wasn't swordsmanship. It wasn't even his growing knowledge of talismans and arrays. It was people. More specifically, talking to people. The realization wasn't entirely surprising. In his previous life, he had rarely left the hospital room. Yet despite that, he had spoken to countless people. Doctors, nurses, hospital staff, volunteers, visitors, even other patients. At first because he was lonely, later because he genuinely enjoyed it. He had learned that a smile went a long way. A kind word went even further. More than once, a nurse had laughed and told him, "With a face like yours and a mouth like that, you can probably talk your way into anything." At the time, he hadn't thought much of it. Now, however, Wei Ying intended to take full advantage of it. The market streets of Ezhou bustled with activity. Stalls lined both sides of the road. Merchants shouted prices. Customers haggled loudly. Children darted through the crowds. Wei Ying wandered through it all with ease, a smile permanently attached to his face. He stopped at one stall, then another, like a butterfly drifting from flower to flower. "Jia, your embroidery is beautiful." The woman behind the stall immediately brightened. "Oh, you know embroidery?" "Not at all." Wei Ying grinned. "But beautiful things are easy to recognize." The woman laughed. By the time he left, she was still smiling. At another stall, he complimented an elderly vendor's vegetable display. At a third, he praised someone's handmade baskets. At a fourth, he convinced a merchant to explain the differences between 3 types of tea. All while learning, observing, listening. People loved talking when they felt appreciated. And Wei Ying was very good at making people feel appreciated. Eventually, his wandering brought him to a small side street. There, an elderly woman struggled with several wooden crates. The boxes were clearly too heavy for her. Without hesitation, Wei Ying stepped forward. "Papa, do you need help?" The old woman blinked, then immediately looked relieved. "Would you?" "Of course." The crates weren't particularly heavy, at least not for a cultivator. A few trips later, everything had been safely delivered to her stall. The old woman looked delighted. "Such a good child." Wei Ying laughed. "I only carried some boxes." "Nonsense." She immediately reached for a basket beside her. "Take something." "There is no need." "There is." "No, really, Dash." "There is." The argument continued for several minutes. Eventually, realizing resistance was futile, Wei Ying gave in. His gaze swept across the basket, then settled on a simple lantern. "Then I'll take this." The old woman looked surprised. "Only that." "It's useful, portable, practical, and far easier to carry than vegetables." The old woman clicked her tongue. Before he could react, she stuffed a small bottle into his hands. "Take this too." Wei Ying blinked. "Papa Dash." "Lantern oil." She patted his hand firmly. "A lantern without oil is useless." Then she gently squeezed his fingers. "Take care of yourself, child." For a brief moment, something in her expression reminded him of the nurses from his previous life. The ones who always worried whether he was eating enough, sleeping enough, living enough. His smile softened. "Thank you." A little later, he found work again. One merchant was loading supplies onto a carriage. The task clearly required more hands than he currently possessed. Wei Ying offered assistance. The merchant readily accepted. Within minutes, several heavy crates had been stacked neatly inside the wagon. The man looked impressed. "You're stronger than you look." Wei Ying grinned. "I get that a lot." The merchant laughed and tossed him a few copper coins. Wei Ying accepted them happily. His first earnings. Not much, but enough. Enough to prove he could do this. Enough to justify opening his finance notebook later. The thought alone made him smile. His luck continued. Or perhaps it was simply his charm. At one point, he stopped to admire a fruit stall. The woman running it had a warm face and an easy laugh. After several minutes of conversation, she shook her head. "You're too sweet." Wei Ying blinked innocently. "Me?" "Yes, you." The woman reached into a basket. A moment later, 2 bright red apples landed in his hands. "For free." Wei Ying immediately protested. She immediately ignored him. The argument lasted approximately 3 seconds. Then he accepted defeat. Again, by the time afternoon arrived, Wei Ying had accumulated a lantern, a bottle of oil, several copper coins, 2 apples, and a growing collection of acquaintances. Not bad for his first morning as a rogue cultivator. Not bad at all. As he wandered deeper into the city, nibbling on one of the apples, Wei Ying found himself smiling. For years, survival had meant enduring. Then Lotus Pier had meant preparing. Today was different. Today felt like living. And he was beginning to understand why his parents had spent their lives traveling. By the time the sun climbed high into the sky, the morning rush of the market had begun to slow. Wei Ying glanced upward. The day was still young. Yet he had already earned a few coins, acquired a lantern, and gathered a surprising amount of information about the city. Not bad. Still, there was something more important than wandering. Study. If he intended to survive as a rogue cultivator, he couldn't neglect his cultivation. Nor could he neglect the knowledge he had spent months gathering. So after purchasing a simple lunch from a food stall, Wei Ying returned to the inn. The room was pleasantly cool. Closing the door behind him, he settled at the table. The city noises became distant. His attention shifted immediately. Work first, then play. From his chinkoan pouch, he retrieved several notebooks. The familiar sight immediately put him at ease. These were not merely notes. They were the foundation of his future. The first notebook concerned cultivation theory. Wei Ying opened it and began reading. Meridian systems, spiritual circulation, core stabilization, the relationship between spiritual energy and physical health. Subjects that had once seemed dry now held genuine importance, especially to someone who valued his body more than most cultivators ever would. For an entire hour, he studied quietly, occasionally pausing to consider a point or compare different explanations. Without instructors nearby, he found himself thinking more deeply about the material than before, not because anyone demanded it, because he wanted to understand. After that came his favorite subject, talismans and arrays. Immediately his posture straightened. The slight boredom from cultivation theory vanished. He opened another notebook, then another. His eyes scanned diagrams, symbols, spiritual pathways, array structures. The more he learned, the more fascinated he became. Cultivation often focused on personal strength. Talismans and arrays felt different. Creative, flexible. They rewarded understanding, innovation, imagination. The possibilities seemed endless. For another hour, Wei Ying immersed himself completely. Not rushing, not copying, simply studying. Trying to understand why certain structures worked, why certain symbols connected, why spiritual energy flowed the way it did. This time, he took no notes. There was no need. He already possessed the information. Understanding it mattered far more. Instead, he pulled out a stack of low-quality paper purchased earlier that morning. Cheap, rough, perfect for practice. Dipping his brush into ink, he began drawing. Sigils first. Simple ones. The sort found in beginner texts. His first attempts looked terrible. The lines were uneven. Several symbols were crooked. One collapsed entirely halfway through. Wei Ying stared at it, then laughed. That one would probably explode. Fortunately, it was only practice paper. He simply started again, and again, and again. With each attempt, the lines became steadier, the shapes more precise, the flow more natural. By the end of the session, a small pile of discarded papers sat beside him. Evidence of progress. Arrays proved even more difficult. A single misplaced line could ruin the entire structure. Several times, he found himself redrawing the same formation repeatedly, adjusting proportions, comparing notes, checking measurements. The challenge only made it more enjoyable. When something finally looked correct, the sense of satisfaction was immense. Wei Ying found himself smiling. This was fun, genuinely fun. Not because anyone expected it, not because it would earn praise, simply because he enjoyed it. The realization felt strangely liberating. Eventually, he set the brush aside. His wrist ached slightly. His eyes felt tired. A glance through the window told him the afternoon was already slipping away. Time for the final task. Meditation. Wei Ying moved to the center of the room, crossed his legs, closed his eyes, and breathed. Spiritual energy flowed quietly through his meridians. Gentle, steady. The familiar circulation soothed his mind. Unlike the frantic cultivation sessions of Lotus Pier, there was no pressure here. No competition. No expectations. Only himself. His core. and the steady rhythm of spiritual energy. An hour passed surprisingly quickly. When he finally opened his eyes, the sunlight outside had softened considerably. The worst heat of the day was gone. The evening market would soon come alive. Wei Ying stood and stretched. His joints popped softly. The room suddenly felt too small. Outside, he could already hear merchants preparing for the evening crowd. Voices drifted through the window. Laughter, music, the promise of another adventure. A grin spread across his face. He carefully stored his notebooks, collected his practice papers, checked his money pouch, then headed for the door. The day wasn't over yet, and Ezhou still had plenty left to show him. The evening market felt different from the morning one. The frantic rush of business had faded. People were more relaxed now. Vendors chatted with neighboring stalls. Perfect. The river reflected moonlight beautifully. The water moved lazily beneath the night sky. Wei Ying stood there for a moment, listening, breathing, then reached into his chinquan pouch. Po Xiao appeared in his hand. The sword gleamed softly beneath the moonlight. For a brief moment, Wei Ying simply held it, feeling its weight, its balance, its presence. Then he closed his eyes. Cultivators often described a connection with their swords, a partnership, a mutual understanding. Wei Ying's bond with Po Xiao was still young, still shallow, yet it existed, faintly, like a distant thread connecting them. The sword hummed gently, almost imperceptibly, but enough to make him smile. Let's practice. He began with the forms he already knew, the 3 foundational Jiang sect sword sets he had learned before the incident. Slowly, carefully, one movement after another, his body flowed through the familiar patterns. Not perfectly, but competently. The forms felt different outside Lotus Pier. There were no instructors watching, no disciples competing, no expectations, only himself and the sword. After finishing the familiar forms, he paused, then began again, this time moving into the sequences he had memorized while recovering. The forms he had spent 2 months secretly observing from the edge of the training grounds. At first, the movements were clumsy. Transitions lacked smoothness. Several stances felt awkward, but he remembered them. Every sequence, every step, every turn. The countless hours spent watching had not been wasted. Once, twice, 3 times. Again and again he moved through the forms, correcting mistakes, improving details, building familiarity. The moon climbed higher overhead. His breathing gradually grew heavier. Sweat soaked through his robes. His arms burned. His hands ached. Yet a smile never left his face. Because he could do this. Because his body obeyed him. Because every sore muscle was proof that he was alive. Eventually, exhaustion won. Wei Ying lowered his sword. His chest rose and fell rapidly. His entire body felt warm. Satisfied. The river looked particularly inviting. Without hesitation, he stripped down to his inner robes and stepped into the water. The coolness hit him immediately. Wonderful. He laughed, then dove forward. The river wasn't especially deep near the bank. Perfect for swimming. He moved through the water with ease. Back and forth. Back and forth. Part exercise. Part bath. Part celebration. By the time he emerged, most of the sweat had been washed away, along with much of the fatigue. After drying himself and changing into a clean set of clothes, Wei Ying packed away Po Xiao once more. The sword disappeared into his chinquan pouch. The connection lingered faintly in his awareness. Comforting, reliable, a companion for the road ahead. The walk back to the inn felt peaceful. The streets had grown quiet. Most businesses were closed. Lanterns glowed softly outside homes and shops. The city seemed to be settling into sleep. Wei Ying found himself yawning. His body was beginning to protest everything he had put it through. Hours of walking, physical labor, sword practice, swimming, cultivation, study. For perhaps the first time since arriving in this world, he had spent an entire day completely according to his own wishes. And now he was exhausted, wonderfully exhausted. When he finally returned to his room, he barely managed to remove his outer robe before collapsing onto the bed. His muscles ached. His hands felt heavy. His eyelids were already closing. A small smile appeared on his face. Tomorrow would bring new experiences, new people, new places. But those could wait. For now, there was only sleep. And as Wei Ying drifted off beneath the quiet sounds of Ezhou's night, he knew with absolute certainty that he would sleep very well indeed.